Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing something pretty fun. We're stepping into the shoes of an epistemological detective. We are unpacking a genuinely fascinating philosophical investigation laid out by the thinker Abu Yarub al-Marzuki in his work Equations of Existence and Survival. We'll be looking specifically at his deep dive into exactly how we read, analyze, and ultimately judge foundational religious texts, in this case, the Quran. Now, this isn't just your standard history lesson. It's a really rigorous look at the very tools and assumptions that modern scholars use to analyze ancient texts. Basically, we're going to explore that super fine line between objective science and, well, ideological bias. Okay, let's dive into this. Right at the absolute heart of Abu Yarub al-Marzuki's analysis is this massive, unavoidable dilemma. When modern scholars look at a text like the Quran, what exactly are they seeing? Are they looking at what Marzuki calls a syncretic compilation, which is basically a patchwork of borrowed ideas? Or on the flip side, are they looking at a self-contained critical system with its own unified, overarching purpose? How a scholar answers this single question literally dictates how they engage with the whole text. So, let's move into Section 1, the core question. Before we really get into the weeds of this intense philosophical debate, we kind of need to lay down our foundational terminology so we can track exactly how Marzuki defines the opposing viewpoint. He introduces this specific term to describe how certain critics view the text, the syncretic compilation, or in Arabic, Musannaf Talfiqi. He defines this as a text that can essentially be reduced entirely to intertextuality and plagiarism. According to this specific view, the text is just a mirror, right? It just reflects its social and cultural context. It doesn't have a self-contained internal logic, and crucially, it completely lacks a clear overarching goal. Think of it like how someone might analyze anonymous folk literature, a collection of local myths produced by multiple unknown authors without any single unified purpose. According to Marzuki, when critics treat a text this way, they completely miss its systemic meaning. All right, that brings us to Section 2, the Islamologist claim. So how does this definition apply to real-world modern scholarship? Well, Marzuki points out that a dominant prevailing school of modern scholars, who he refers to as Islamologists, they apply this exact syncretic compilation framework to the Quranic text. These critics, he argues, see their primary mission as this kind of hunt for borrowed or plagiarized elements. Their whole goal is to track down the sources of these elements to construct a purely social and cultural history of the text. They rely heavily on explicit or implicit intertextuality, essentially trying to prove that the text is just a product of its environment. And the wild thing is, for these scholars, this framework represents the absolute height of modern scientific methodology. And this brilliantly illustrates our next point in Section 3, the epistemological illusion. You have to ask, does the approach of these modern Islamologists actually represent a faithful description of the text? Marzuki argues, absolutely not. Look, these modern critics claim their approach is cutting-edge, objective science. However, Marzuki argues that this approach is fundamentally flawed. Because it lacks descriptive honesty and methodological caution, he says it isn't actually modern science at all. Instead, it's an epistemological regression that masks a deep, underlying ideological bias. He even suggests that this approach is actually more akin to medieval theological disputes or even dogmatic Marxist frameworks than it is to true modern positive science. Let's break down the roots of this illusion and why exactly Marzuki calls it a regression. First off, he argues it completely ignores the critical boundaries of human knowledge. He references some truly monumental figures here. Al-Ghazali, who symbolizes the start of the Arab critical school, and Immanuel Kant, symbolizing the goal of the Western critical school. Both of these philosophers explicitly recognize the strict limits of what humans can actually know. But these modern critics, Marzuki argues they operate under this illusion of omniscience. They honestly think they can perfectly comprehend all reality. Second, they reduce all human thought and action to mere reflections of social and historical forces. They take the unknown and confidently reduce it to the known. And finally, they rely heavily on Hegelian and Marxist views, making history, with a capital H, the ultimate unquestionable judge, completely bypassing the critical limits established by philosophy. Moving on to Section 4, Traditional Exegesis and Context. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that classical scholars didn't just sit around waiting for modern Islamologists to teach them about historical context. As the tradition of tafsir, or Islamic exegesis, evolved, early scholars actively integrated religious ideas and historical news, things like the Israeliyat. Later on, they used philology and pre-Islamic Arab poetry to understand obscure vocabulary. And finally, they incorporated rhetoric and basic history, like the days of the Arabs and the histories of major contemporary peoples. The takeaway here is that they actively built their interpretive system upon the historical context of their time, showing a really deep awareness of their intellectual environment.
I mean, just look at the sheer diversity of contextual sources that were openly utilized by these traditional commentators. It's vast. They didn't hide their sources at all. They openly referenced Jewish and Christian religious texts. They looked closely at ongoing theological disputes. They even referenced ancient natural religions present in their era, like Zoroastrianism and Sabianism, right alongside pre-Islamic poetry. Marzuki's point here is absolutely crucial. Identifying intertextuality and using social context is not some fancy modern invention. It was a foundational, universally accepted tool in classical studies.
Which brings us to Section 5, the real dispute. So think about this for a second. If both traditional scholars and modern critics are looking at historical context, and both sides completely acknowledge intertextuality, what on earth are they actually fighting about? Because both camps are utilizing the exact same historical data, but they arrive at completely different valuations of the text itself. Here's the difference. Traditional scholars use context as a vital tool, like an auxiliary science, to help them understand the profound message and the system of the text. Modern critics, on the other hand, use that exact same context to reduce the text's status, to strip it of its systemic meaning and just label it a mere plagiarized compilation. The data is exactly the same. The intent is entirely different. This crucial point is captured perfectly in a quote from Marzuki himself. He writes, "The problem is not related to intertextuality or the sociocultural context, but rather the status that the critics of the Quran attribute via these arguments to reduce the Quran to a syncretic compilation and literary theft." It's so well said. The fight isn't about whether context exists. The fight is entirely over the text's designated status and the respect afforded to its internal structure. And all of this builds into Marzuki's final assessment of the modern critic's real motives. He concludes that the source of these modern illusions is, at its core, fundamentally ideological. This isn't just some echo of medieval debates between competing religions. No, Marzuki identifies this as a distinctively modern, post-Hegelian and Marxist animosity directed against religion in general, and Islam specifically. It's this deeply ingrained ideological drive that just masquerades as objective historical criticism. Which brings us to our final provocative thought for this explainer. As we evaluate how we study major historical and religious texts, we have to ask ourselves, does reducing a foundational text purely to its historical and cultural context actually reveal its ultimate truth? Or actually, scratch that, does that reductionist approach merely expose our own modern ideological biases? Marzuki leaves us with a pretty stark reminder that true scientific inquiry requires recognizing our own epistemological limits. Thank you so much for joining me on this intellectual journey today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.